Welcome to the Pelvic Health and Fitness podcast. We have Rhonda and myself, Dayna, here today to chat about 7 reasons your pelvic floor symptoms may have changed recently. As a pelvic physio, it's super common for me to sort of graduate people and say, go and play with your movements, you're symptom free, and then have them end up back in my office, several days or weeks, maybe months, years later, upset because their symptoms have come up again for them. And while I never want anybody to experience symptoms, and obviously the goal is to always have you symptom free from, the time we graduate until forever, it happens. We are creatures of our environment. We have a lot of factors at play, especially as a female, as moms. There's a lot of physical demands, stressors, mental health demands, changes in schedule, depending on where you are in your motherhood journey. Maybe you're not getting a lot of sleep, hormones. So we're going to go through some of the big ones today.
Yeah. And I think it's, serves as a reminder. We've talked about this on the podcast before, that symptoms are our body's way of talking to us, letting us know how it's doing. It's hard to not be afraid of symptoms, but let's try to just be curious about those symptoms and not blame ourselves if symptoms do arise, because there are many reasons, and we're going to go over 7 of those reasons today why your symptoms may have increased or decreased. So a couple of these might be about decreasing symptoms as well. So
sorry, go ahead, Dayna. Just to be clear, when we say symptoms, it could be anything.
Yes.
Leaking, urgency, constipation, pain, heaviness, anything.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. So the first one on our list for a reason why your symptoms may have increased lately is a change in your sleep pattern. So this is obviously super common in those early postpartum phases where your sleep is dependent on what your baby is doing. So sleep regressions are real. So even fast forward to where Dayna and I are at in our parenthood journey, where our kids are, the oldest ones are, how old is your oldest? 7, 6?
6. Oh, don't fast forward time that much.
6. I know. 6 and 5. And, they'll be up in the night for a multitude of reasons still. I feel like that was like an epiphany for me. Oh, like once your kids sleep through the night, that's the end. No. They still get up in the night.
Sorry if that's bad news.
Yes. But yeah, so change of sleep pattern. So our sleep is affected by our kids' sleep. And so we might be up for different reasons, and that can affect your symptoms. So many of us know, it's sort of common knowledge that we do a lot of healing in our sleep. And so if we're lacking sleep, our sleep is all over the place, we might have an increase in inflammation, which may contribute to worsening symptoms. Our sleep can affect our hormones and chemical levels in our body that might, make us more susceptible to pain. It's also going to affect our mental health, which many of us know, when we are tired, we are more irritable. And this might make us more sensitive to pain, which seems, you can understand that when you are irritable, you're going to be more likely to be annoyed by the pain that you're experiencing as well. So that is a totally normal occurrence. If you're lacking sleep, your symptoms might increase.
Absolutely. You sort of touched on this next one a little bit, but a shift in hormones, variety of reasons this can happen. It can be your cycle starting for the first time postpartum. It can be that, maybe you have a little bit, we all do. You have changes in your hormones throughout your actual cycle, month to month. So for some of us, we're going to have sensitive zones, whether that's ovulation or right before your period starts. But we also have hormonal shifts that happen sort of for a variety of reasons. One, lack of sleep. Lack of sleep can change with sleep regressions. Any of that sort of change, sick kids, which this is January of 2023, if you're listening currently. So if December 2022, if you know, shift in hormones, your cycle, sleep, breastfeeding changes, whether, you're starting to wean, we'll touch on this one a little bit. going forward. But if you're weaning, if you're trying to develop a breastfeeding schedule, if it's changing for whatever reason, hormones affect us directly. They affect the pelvic floor. They are involved with our sexual organs. They're involved with the uterus itself. The uterus does tend to swell a little bit and sit a little bit lower, especially in those first few days of your period. So that can lead to a little bit more load. Heaviness is very common in this time period for some. It's one of the reasons I don't jump my first day of my period. It just doesn't feel comfortable for me. So hormones, they're constantly changing, especially in that first year postpartum, but certainly we are not exempt from the fluctuations as we go further from our births and can affect symptoms.
Yeah. And I'll just throw this one in here, just talking about cycles and periods with leaking. So I know me personally, I feel like I've heard this more too with like wearing tampons and Diva cups, that I get a little bit more worsening of my leaking and urgency symptoms during that time. And for me, I think it's related to, I feel more pelvic floor tension when I have a Diva cup in. So it's sort of, I'm subconsciously clenching a little bit more. So those can all be factors as well. And all that to say too, you know, if you want to see a pelvic floor physio to work on these things, awesome. I know for me, the urgency and leaking isn't enough of a disruption of my life to make huge changes. I do a lot of more pelvic floor relaxation during my period to help. But so yeah, just to add that, throw that in the hat too, that, you know, if you want to change your symptoms and you want to make them better with pelvic floor physio, amazing. But if you're okay with symptoms, then that is totally valid too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So the third one we have on our list is an increase in stress and anxiety, which is a big one. Dayna and I've touched on this a bunch of times in our podcast. So pandemic, sicknesses, whether that's we are sick, our kids are sick, getting back to work. I find that's a big one with my clients, you know, when they are transitioning back to work at a year or 18 months, whatever it might be, sudden surge of symptoms. And the holidays. So Dayna and I just kind of talked about this before we hit record. A few of our clients have been mentioning an increase in symptoms after Christmas. So yeah, so all of that to say, there's, you know, many reasons our mental health might be affected, and this can directly relate to symptoms. It could be leading to an increase in pelvic floor tension, because when we are tense and stressed, we'll have a tendency to hold that tension, literally hold that tension in our bodies, in our belly, in our glutes, in our pelvic floor. I know that for myself, in our jaw. Thank you, Dayna. Yeah. And that irritability and increased stress that we feel will impact our nervous system as well. So again, it'll make us more sensitive, more sensitized to pain. So our threshold for pain will be that much lower. And, you know, during the holidays, for example, or when our kids are sick, we just don't have as much downtime because we're so busy taking care of everybody and going places during the holidays, doing all the things. So our body, again, feels that constant busyness, and our nervous system, our body needs that downtime. And when we don't have that downtime, our symptoms might increase.
For sure. Our pelvic floor muscles are not different than any other kinds of muscles in our body. I think that's important to know. So like if you're someone who gets neck tension when you are stressed, your pelvic floor could very well be tight as well. It's, you know, they're not specialized types of muscles. They have a lot of special functions, but they essentially operate the same as your bicep and your neck and your traps and things.
Yep.
Already sort of touched on breastfeeding as one of the reasons that your pelvic floor symptoms may have changed, but certainly I think it's worth bringing up again. I often will mention this to people if I'm sort of graduating them, maybe let's just pick a random 6 months postpartum, they're sort of symptom free. I go over all of these when they, you know, so that, because I think information is power. One that can surprise people is the change in the breastfeeding. So when and if you decide to stop breastfeeding, if there's any sort of weaning, maybe baby's on a hunger strike, you know, for whatever reason, it changes the hormonal picture. And I don't know all of the ins and outs of it specifically, but anytime our hormones are involved, coming back to sort of that second one there, breastfeeding being a big hormonal hormonally driven activity, it can affect the pelvic floor as well. I also too, if you've sort of like changed position. So I find, in the beginning, and I think about this too with me, everybody's always in sort of this quiet, calm environment in the nursery. As you start to get a little bit more adept, or maybe you've just got other kids around, if you're starting to breastfeed while doing all sorts of other things, I think it can just sometimes be the overall, again, load on your pelvic floor. If you're starting to breastfeed while sweeping the floor and teaching algebra to your other kids, like honestly, because moms are amazing, it can be just overall work. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's worth noting with that too is I have heard people mention that their pelvic floor symptoms get better when they wean.
Yes.
Not to say that that's a reason to stop your breastfeeding journey early, because obviously, there's so much benefit to that. But if you're noticing that your pelvic floor, like your heaviness or your leaking improves, it could just be, again, that shift in hormonal picture that might improve your symptoms.
Yeah, it can affect the level of estrogen in our bodies, right? And so estrogen is involved in the plumpness of, for lack of a better description, of the pelvic floor. It can be involved in how readily we self-lubricate for arousal, for intimacy or intercourse as well. So those are sort of the big ticket items. So yes, certainly I have had several clients where we sort of get to a spot where we're better, but we're stuck. And even we'll refer to gynae. Is there anything you can try, like a topical estrogen, and again, check with your doctors for this if it's a really bothersome symptom. My understanding is that doesn't make it into the breast milk, but always double check with your providers, your medical providers. But I've had several gynecologists say, yeah, if you've done pelvic physio, you've had some success and you're still having it, it might just be something that sort of lingers until you stop breastfeeding, and it's not immediate. It can take up to 6 to 8 weeks after. So if that is you, there is hope. For some people, it just is the change there really affects the floor and its symptoms.
For sure. Yeah. And it kind of ties into like the increase in stress too, because not for every person, but there might be people who wean their baby as soon as they're getting back to work. So the stress of getting back to work, mixed with weaning, yes, of course, it's a recipe for maybe symptoms getting worse.
Yes.
All right. So the next one on the list, and this is one we touch on the podcast all the time as well, is a change in bowel habits. So there is a huge link to things like constipation and pelvic floor symptoms. So if you want to go back to an episode that we did with Aaliyah, Box Wellness Co., she did an amazing job of talking about this. Having good, healthy poops, how that can make your pelvic floor that much happier. So yes, when we're constipated, we are straining more on the toilet, having that downward pushing force into the pelvic floor, which might contribute to symptoms, might increase that heaviness feeling that we might be having. Just having more work on the pelvic floor can lead to maybe more leaking symptoms, that type of thing. So if you're noticing a change in your bowel habits, addressing sort of the big ticket things with that would be making sure you're drinking enough water, making sure you're having enough fiber, using a squatty potty, just looking into those things to help with the constipation. And most likely that will also help with your pelvic floor symptoms.
Yes. Don't delay the urge to go poop. It's the hardest one with kids.
Oh yeah.
Try not to delay the urge. That stool moves back up into the body relatively quickly and more water gets drawn out, so that it's harder the next time you try. It's a little bit harder to fully empty. So yeah, constipation's a big one. For sure. Any change in your exercise routine, up or down? Maybe you're moving your body a little bit more, maybe you're moving your body a little bit less, maybe you've changed the intensity of your exercise and the frequency is the same, up or down. Any I often use the analogy of a bank account in our pelvic floor. So, depending on how many resources you've used up in your day-to-day life, if you're in the thick of it with a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old, and now you've been sort of increasing your exercise steadily, no troubles, but now you're running and you're doing a lot more impact, for example, you're using a lot more of that resource. So we might just need to sort of reallocate some funds. I'm suddenly a banker. um reallocate some funds to make you symptom free, or up or down. Maybe for you, having that sort of consistent exercise routine is good range of motion. You're really good at having your down trainers at the end of a workout, and Christmas got busy, life happens, and you've gone away from sort of that checking in with tension, whether that's jaw, belly, bum checks throughout the day, or specifically doing some sort of breathing exercise. And so now you've got some pelvic floor symptoms. Very, very common. It can be linked to exercise in general. It can be linked to just our overall activity in life. More or less can bring on symptoms.
Yeah. And I'll just touch on, because this came up with a couple of my clients after the holidays. I know, we're focusing in on the pelvic floor, but like we said in previous episodes, the pelvic floor muscles aren't special. They behave very similar to all the other muscles in our body. And so I had a bunch of clients complain of like neck, upper back tension after the holidays. And so that could be a multitude of reasons. Again, just we're stressed, we're maybe around family situations that are stressful. We're here, there, and everywhere. I know for me, I was lucky. We did a lot of busyness, but we also had some downtime. Or if my kids are sick and I'm resting more and I'm laying on the couch more, my neck gets so angry. That's the first thing to get angry if I'm not moving my body as much. And so, yeah, getting back to this. It doesn't seem fair. I know, right? So for me, my body, it's just a reminder. And as I get to know my body better, that, regular movement is so important. And so a big one with that though is learning and being wise enough to ease back in after a period of time where maybe you haven't been exercising. So that is also maybe an indication if your pelvic floor symptoms suddenly increase, making sure that you are tapering back in and not just diving right back into super high intensity, super high load. Working with a postpartum coach might help with that. If you're like, I don't know how to do that. That's an important piece too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our final one, and sort of what prompted this topic when we were brainstorming some ideas for episodes, is sickness. Sickness can be a major reason. So, I mean, yes, your own body for sure. I think coughing, sneezing, vomiting, those are tiny little marathon, not even tiny. They're a little marathon every single day that you are sick and blowing your nose and coughing. Coughing is very hard on your pelvic floor, and it tends to go on for 14 days. Right? So it's like a really hard workout on top of your pelvic floor. Many of us listening, anyways, my grammar today is poor. Many of you listening, we are moms as well. So again, you're likely caring for sick children. If you are not sick yourself and caring for sick children, that can take a toll on your pelvic floor. You're likely out of your routines. Maybe some of these other things that we've already discussed are coming up for you a little bit more. You certainly probably are carrying around younger children, snuggling them a little bit more. That the stress of having kids, again, it's sort of early 2023. The illnesses in the end of 2022 were intense. I don't really know what happened to the common cold, but everything seems to just be crazy. So it's stressful, and that can bring on symptoms. If you are also sick and you are now caring for other people on top of that, that load just multiplies. And then depending on if you are somebody who tries to then get back into working out, maybe before your cold has passed and you're coughing and now you're jumping as well, or you're doing weight training, that can also compound symptoms. So just lots of grace and rest for yourself, understanding that symptoms can absolutely flare up when you have a cold. Again, hopefully the further you get away from your birth, this becomes less of an issue. I had a client this week who she's about 6 months, I think, postpartum, and was feeling really great when I saw her in September, and is quite active, and was very upset. She had only leaked once during her illness, which was in my mind actually quite great, considering she had, you know, sick children and a couple illnesses back to back. But for her, it was really upsetting. And so just a lot of reassurance about what her body has been doing
Yeah.
around Christmas. Like we've already touched on, out of routine, sleeping in different beds, traveling around. Sickness is a big one. I often will give people that heads up when they leave my room as well, that maybe those are the times when you're sick that we sort of really try, in the moments when we are not sneezing, coughing, blowing your nose, vomiting, to check in with tension, jaw, belly, bums, checks. Even if you're lying on the couch, you might be shocked to find that you're sort of gripping everywhere. It's okay to do some reverse Kegels, maybe some gentle movement if you're feeling up to it, like cat, cow, child's pose, can really help ward off some of the effects of that big workout in the core.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, if you've, worked with a pelvic floor physio, listen to our podcast, we teach, when you're coughing, when you're sneezing, when you're throwing up, to do a little bit of the knack. So a little bit of like a pelvic floor lift to help with the strain, the downward strain on the pelvic floor. So yeah, if you think about that, if you're constantly like gripping throughout the day, every time you're coughing to prevent that downward pressure, that is a huge workout. That's a huge amount of load repetitively throughout that sickness. So yes, of course, your pelvic floor is going to be fatigued. And so I think, a reminder in that regard too. So even for Dayna and I, we do this for a living. We know all these things. The few sicknesses that I had recently, my pelvic floor was not happy. I was getting some of like the lower abdomen discomfort that I sometimes get. I was getting a little bit worsening of my leaking, urgency symptoms. And so a lot of that is just like acceptance too, of like, this is the phase I'm in. I'm sick. I'm coughing all the time. Yes, my pelvic floor is not happy right now, but this is temporary. Again, doing all the things Dayna mentioned, pelvic floor relaxation strategies if you can. But yes, also just reminding yourself this will get better. And yes, your pelvic floor will recover and will heal.
No, yeah, for sure. I had a horrible cough. I am a pelvic physio. I was leaking. It happens. It happens to all of us. I on our graduation day, I always have these conversations with my clients. I give them these sort of situations and let them know that they are armed, I hope, with the tools. We've talked a lot about pelvic floor relaxation. I know when you're having symptoms, it can seem very like, I'm leaking and you want me to relax tension. But if you're, just think about it again as your contracted bicep. If it's really tired, it doesn't really make sense to stack a whole bunch of books on top of that and walk around like that, or do bicep curls. It makes sense to sort of gently take that muscle through a range of motion, or maybe just let it dangle by your side. Again, your pelvic floor is no different. The other thing I just want to mention too, and I mention it to all of my clients, is I always get asked the question, do I have to keep doing these things forever? So let's just say Kegels and reverse Kegels in by themselves. And I often say, I would love it if you did, because, we don't really think twice about going out for a walk or doing squats, because we know the long-term benefits of keeping these things in our lives. Your pelvic floor really, again, being like any other muscle group, needs to be tuned up. Yeah. For some of us, that's strength. For some of us, it's relaxation. For many of us, it's a combination of both. And certainly over time, if you have symptoms flare up, you've gone back to what you've done from your coaches or your pelvic physio or just your own knowledge, and it hasn't settled, maybe it's time for a reassessment. We change across our lifespan. So maybe we need to change those, proportions of Kegels to reverse Kegels or whatever. But the important part is we want to keep them in there as best we can. Life will happen. You'll ultimately go away from doing them, of course, but they're tools you can always come back to. And the more often we come back to things, the more likely they are to become a habit. And that can help buffer some of these things from happening when they do happen as well.
Yeah. And I will say, I will fully admit, as someone that does this for a living, I don't do deliberate intentional Kegels, because I, remind clients of this all the time, that strengthening, so whole body strengthening, is pelvic floor strengthening. So as
Absolutely.
we rehab our body and learn about like the automaticity of those muscles, where our pelvic floor will do what it needs to do. Yes, in the beginning, or yes, if there are symptoms involved, we might need to do that deliberate Kegel training, pairing it with the breath, pairing it with movement. But yes, like I am relatively symptom free. I strength train my body on a regular basis, and I trust that my pelvic floor is doing a Kegel with every movement that it needs to do, right? And not intentionally thinking about it. Because for me, that is what makes my symptoms worse. When I overanalyze and I overthink, like, what is my pelvic floor doing while I do this lift? That tends to make my symptoms worse. So, but I will say I do intentionally do pelvic floor relaxation, hip mobility, breathing at the end of my workouts, because that is what my body struggles with. And so intentionally doing reverse Kegels and breathing into my pelvic floor is what I need to do probably forever.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why Kegels are not one size fits all. I
Yeah.
think that's becoming more and more common, which is great. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most people should be relaxing their pelvic floors for every, our pelvic floors are contracting with whatever we do through the day. So we could all benefit. And even if it's just meditation to you, essentially you're just releasing tension in your body. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll just review them all quickly. So this is a non-exhaustive list. Of course, there might be other things we didn't touch on, but these are kind of the 7 common ones that popped into our head. So 7 reasons your pelvic floor symptoms may have changed recently. Number 1, a change in your sleep pattern. Number 2, a shift in your hormones. So a return of your cycle, for example. Number 3, an increase in stress and anxiety. Number 4, a change in your breastfeeding schedule / maybe if you're weaning. Number 5, change in your bowel habits, something like constipation. Number 6, change in your exercise routine, moving your body more or less. And then the last one, sickness, which is a big one right now. So just again, as that reassurance that don't blame yourself if symptoms are increasing. There are many, many reasons that can explain that change.
Absolutely.